All right, Lacey, whenever you want to begin, you can go ahead.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you guys so much for attending tonight's meeting. I've heard a lot about your group, and I think what you guys are doing is very commendable. So thank you, and it's an honor to be here this evening. My name is Lacie Thorne. I've had a career in the fashion industry that has spanned a wide variety of perspectives that took me to New York and Hong Kong, and ultimately to Yale University where I started a fashion resale company, and then ultimately to Nashville, Tennessee, which is where I'm living now. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my career progression, some realizations I made by working in fast fashion industry, and the pivots that I took, and ultimately what I'm doing now. All right. So this is kind of the highlight reel. So I grew up here in Nashville and knew that I wanted to go into the fashion industry. My parents were like, "You are not moving to New York City as an 18-year-old." So I went to SMU, which is in Texas, and got my business degree in marketing. And the minute that I graduated from SMU, I moved to New York and enrolled in Parsons School of Design and got my associate's degree in fashion design. And while I was there, I interned at Theory and DKNY. That was my introduction to the fashion industry. So my first job after Parsons was working with a freelance company called 24/7, designing Christmas sweaters before they were even ironically cool. It was not the glamorous job that I had been anticipating moving to New York and entering into the fashion industry, but it paid the bills and it kept the rent going. So while I was working for 24/7 as a freelancer, my job was primarily to communicate to the factories on behalf of a variety of different brands. This is a screenshot from when I was working at Chico's. And on the left, you see here are what are called flat sketches. They're very detailed sketches made in Adobe Illustrator that communicate the construction details of a garment for the factory's understanding. And on the right is an embroidery layout that really goes into detail about pattern, color, Pantone shades, etc. Here you can see the way that we communicate with factories in the fashion industry. While in any type of academic setting from fashion, you will learn things about color theory and pattern making, draping fabric on a mannequin. There's a lot of sewing involved. But the minute that you graduate and get a job actually working in corporate fashion, you never pick up a sewing machine again 90% of the time for 90% of the jobs. What we see on the screen here is called a tech pack, and this communicates all of the relevant details of a garment to a factory regarding the specs and measurements, construction callouts, fabric details, everything down to how many stitches per inch we require and what size buttons we require. During my time as an early designer, I did a lot of the grunt work for approvals. So on the top left, you see lab dips, where a factory will take the fabric ordered and try to match the Pantone shade associated with our order status. Each fabric reacts differently to the dye chemicals, so there's a process of approval going back and forth until we finally agree on the correct chemical makeup. And on the bottom left-hand corner, you see what are called print strike-offs. We send over the print artwork. There's a detailed process of even getting to that artwork to send over. The factory interprets it, cuts the screens, and sends sample fabric over for the designer's review. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we also see another embroidery layout where we're trying to communicate our vision to the factory and they create a sample and then send it back to us. So this is a garment manufacturing flow chart. On the top left-hand corner, you see merchandising. That then goes into sampling. We source materials. We inspect those materials. We go into pre-production. They finally send us a fit sample where we try it on what is called a fit model. That person's job is to try on all the samples in that particular sample size and tell us how it fits. Can they move their arms correctly? Is it tight when they bend over? We evaluate those and then ultimately go into a prototype sample. We approve that and size it, meaning grade the pattern for size 0 all the way up to 16. Ultimately, there's a final quality inspection for the mass-produced garment. It goes into packing and then into shipment. So after my glamorous gigs at Christmas design sweaters and working for Chico's, my real first opportunity was working for Tibby, which is a designer label in Soho. And I was their garment technical designer. So I was the person creating the measurements. I was the person running the fit samples, recording all of the comments that that fit model made, and then communicating that back to the factory. From there, I worked with 24/7 again. They sent me down to Fort Myers, Florida in 2008, working for a company called White House Black Market. And this is just another example of how detailed the sketches, construction callouts, and print placement can be. In 2009, the financial crash hit, and one of the first industries that is always affected by the fluctuations in the economy is the fashion industry. People tend to save their disposable income for things other than producing and purchasing clothing. And the fashion industry really took a hard hit. I think something like 80% of the fashion industry was laid off between the years 2008 and 2009, and it was a tough time in New York City. So around 2009, 24/7 reached out to me again and asked if I would go to Kohl's design office in New York City and work directly with their vice president of design for something called Brand X. And it wasn't until later that I realized that Brand X was actually the new Jennifer Lopez and Marc Antony line. Uh, and I found out that information by having a trade magazine called Women's Wear Daily pass across my desk. The JLo line ended up being the largest celebrity licensing project in history, with $3.5 billion in confirmed retail sales between a variety of categories, including women's ready-to-wear, shoes, luggage, home goods, soft goods like sheets and bedding and towels, accessories, purses, and then Marc Antony had his own entire menswear line as well. So from there, I had to fly out to Los Angeles to go to Jennifer's home and meet with her and the rest of the design team. This is a few pictures of us in her closet in those early days meetings, where we talked about the aesthetic and the direction that she wanted the line to go in, and ultimately ended up taking pieces from her own personal collection of clothing that we would then interpret for the Kohl's customer, changing a few design details, modifying the fabric, making it appropriate for the target market of the Kohl's customer. When the line launched, it was a big deal. We had a 12-page spread in Oprah magazine. We had a segment on Good Morning America. There were multiple television commercials. We had a Super Bowl ad. It was really everywhere. Billboards. So I worked for JLo for Kohl's for a couple of years. And when her personal stylist and overseer of the line moved over to the Adam Levine for Kmart line, she took me with her. And so I moved from Kohl's to Kmart and basically did the same thing for Adam Levine. That line was run by Tommy and Andy Hilfiger. That's me and Andy there. Tommy had just sold his company, Tommy Hilfiger, to a large corporate conglomerate fashion called Phillips Van Heusen. And they had had some level of arrangement with the Jennifer Lopez brand as well. They helped facilitate the licensing deal for that. And then they wanted to do the same thing for Adam Levine and Kmart. So that's me and my design assistant and Adam Levine talking in our design meetings. Chummy. And then that turned into Nicki Minaj for Sears. And we repeated the process every time we would fly out to Los Angeles, meet with the artist in their home, talk about the direction of the line, interpret that information into ways that we could communicate with the design team back in New York. And that includes mood boards, color stories, pictures of reference materials. This is me in Nikki's closet taking pictures of her accessories and her print inspiration for that Sears line. Doing a little bit of research on luggage and shoes and swimsuits. So all of these lines that I had worked for at that point were really at the mass adoption stage of the fashion life cycle. You might have seen this bell curve previously. Over on the left are fashion innovators, and then a trend gets picked up by opinion leaders. Ultimately, the masses pick up on a style or an aesthetic, and those early innovative designs are interpreted by mass market corporations like Kohl's and Sears and Kmart. And then you have the late adopters and the laggards. But in reality, working for the fashion industry, when I would travel to our overseas manufacturing facilities, oftentimes looked something like this. I was really struck by the level of production that I was seeing in the factories. I remember being in a factory for the Jennifer Lopez launch, and because Kohl's had 1,486 stores, we distributed clothing to all of those stores all across America. So it was not rare for us to often make a purchase order unit for 60,000 pairs of jeans at a time. And I was in the factory, we were working on an order for 60,000 pairs of neon pink jeans for the Jennifer Lopez line. And I honestly saw so many pairs of neon pink jeans that the concept of pants just stopped making sense in my mind. There were pants in every stage of construction. There was one person whose exclusive job was to place the stencil for the back pocket and then move those jeans down the conveyor belt from the manufacturing point. And I really started to think about the raw materials that we were using that were going into these jeans, the cotton that was being grown, the pesticides that were being used on a mass scale to produce 60,000 pairs of jeans. That cotton would then be woven into fabric and shipped from its original growing point to where the weaving factory was. From there, it was shipped to a dyeing factory. Uh, a lot of dyeing happens in places like Bangladesh and Cambodia because they have lower health regulations and environmental protections than other nations, which results in a lower manufacturing cost for the consumer. And the neon dye oftentimes will run the rivers hot pink in some of those places. And then that fabric gets shipped back to China, where it's cut into pattern pieces, sewn in the factory that I saw it in. Each individual garment is placed in a plastic poly bag and placed in a shipping container that then goes on a boat across the ocean to a port in the United States, where it's met by semi trucks that ship it all over the United States to those 1,486 stores. Those jeans would then be sold for $19. And because we were making clothing at a very low quality, I knew that customers were wearing them once or twice and either donating them or just straight throwing them away. And I started to think about the garment industry from a global perspective. And if we, as one brand, were producing 60,000 pairs of jeans at one time, We would often have 12 monthly deliveries of clothing because we wanted the customers to constantly come in and see something new. Those individual monthly deliveries probably had 28 to 30 styles in them. And within corporate Kohl's, we were one of around 25 brands that was doing that. And that's just one corporation in the global supply chain of the garment industry. And I started to think about how insane it was to use that level of raw materials and human labor, shipping carbon dioxide, and then at the end of the process, it was used once or twice and then thrown away. So after I got the Nicki Minaj line launched up and running, I had the opportunity to pivot outside of fast fashion and New York City, and I moved to Hong Kong and started working in the luxury fashion market. When I was there, I became a magazine stylist and then an advertising and communications consultant for productions for luxury brands throughout the Asia Pacific region. I worked with brands like Gucci, Balenciaga, Alexander McQueen. From the LVMH Corporation, there was Celine, Christian Dior, Fendi, Givenchy, and I was pulling pieces from editorial shoot, and then we would also do advertising campaigns for them as well. This is a shoot that I did the art direction for Van Cleef and Arpels. This is a campaign created for an audience in the Asia Pacific, and we shot it in Paris. This is for the luxury brand Keelan, which is under the umbrella of Kering. And while I was in Hong Kong, I became aware of an organization called the Redress Design Award, which was all about rethinking fashion and promoting the concept of circularity. When I was in Hong Kong, had two adorable children who were born over there, and ultimately ended up repatriating to the United States after 5 years in Hong Kong and moving back to Nashville. From there, I took on a faculty role at Belmont University teaching about the fashion industry, but I knew that I wanted to do more and have a bigger impact. So some statistics associated with the fashion industry. In the USA, 10.5 million tons of clothing are sent to a landfill every year. That's about 30 times as heavy as the Empire State Building. Global clothing production has more than doubled since the year 2000. Doubling the useful life of clothing from 1 year to 2 years reduces emissions over the year by 24%. And a typical pair of blue jeans consumes 919 gallons of water during its life cycle. I started doing some research once I got back to the United States about sustainable fashion and started following different accounts on social media, trying to absorb as much information as I could. I started working with Nashville publications to feature sustainable designers and researched manufacturing facilities throughout the United States that were geared towards more sustainable methodologies of manufacturing. On-point manufacturing would not create a garment until the order was placed, and they facilitated a unique manufacturing system that kicked off when that order was placed on their e-commerce website. So during the pandemic, I decided that I wanted to go back to school and get my MBA in sustainability. And I applied to Yale University School of Management and was accepted into their inaugural class of 2021. So this is a screenshot from my Yale application that said a holistic approach to change must be taken to modify fast fashion's unsustainable trajectory, one that incorporates consumer demands and needs, manufacturing parameters, and an equal approach to both ethical labor practices and environmentally responsible raw goods sourcing. So what you see at the bottom of the screen is 4 pillars of a successful sustainable fashion approach. It must be consumer demanded. It must be ethically sourced and environmentally responsible. But consumers, time and time again, have voted with their wallets to say that they are not willing to pay more for these ethically and environmentally responsible clothing. So it's a real quagmire of a business approach and an economic approach that makes it very challenging. While I was at Yale, I started volunteering within their Sci Center for Innovative Thinking, which is basically their entrepreneurial center. And I began speaking about a concept of circular business model that I found through my research. And so I'll tell you about that now. Can you guys still see that okay? Good. Um, so in the beginning of 2021, cryptocurrency had really kicked off, and I had spent some time doing research on investing in crypto. And that opened the door for me to then understand the summer of NFTs in 2022. And I read an article in Rolling Stone magazine that was talking about how music bands were selling their albums as NFTs on the blockchain. And every time that digital asset exchanged hands from a consumer perspective, there was something encoded within it called a smart contract that kicked back a royalty percentage to the band. And I thought, what would happen if we did that with fashion, where every time a garment exchanged hands on a resale website, a royalty commission went not only back to the original brand, the manufacturer, but a little bit of commission to every person that had ever owned that item. It would take the incentive structure into a vertically integrated circular model where consumers and producers are rewarded for producing and purchasing clothing that lasts beyond the first generation of individual. Because right now, what we're seeing in fast fashion and ultra fast fashion, um, there's a certain level of intentionality with how low quality the clothing is because that brand doesn't receive any resale commission on platforms like Poshmark and eBay. So I started pitching Phigitals, which is a combination of physical and digital, to investors. Then when we think about the global fashion industry, we oftentimes think of it in terms of our own closet, which actually looks like this oftentimes. But if we want to clean out this closet, we only have the option of selling on a resale website, which is a lot of work for not a lot of money, or donating it to one of these organizations. But in reality, the fashion industry looks like this. 85% of clothing donations are actually sent overseas, with only 15% of clothing donations being recirculated within the United States. From there, the oversupply of donations and secondhand goods within places like Ghana and Chile have so overwhelmed their demand supply that we end up with unregulated mountains and deserts of polyester clothing that does not biodegrade. The fashion industry is so huge, it's actually responsible for up to 10% of carbon emissions annually, which is more than international flights and shipping combined. So in order to reverse this, we should kind of see the difference and similarities that brands and consumers can benefit from. But it doesn't work that way. Brands don't get a resale commission from these types of platforms, and consumers see secondhand fashion and associate it with donated goods. What both of these individuals are missing is a lack of incentive to take advantage of these already manufactured assets. This is a little bit of my background. So the Phygital solution is to provide royalty payments on clothing resale. And here's how it works. We work with manufacturers to serialize garments at the manufacturing point to individualize them with a QR code and a serial number. When a consumer is ready to clean out their closet and sell 20 different pieces of clothing, they don't have to take the labor of taking pictures of it and listing it. They just scan that QR code, and that tethers to our app where that clothing label has already uploaded pictures, description, care label, and measurements, and you hit sell. We use a peer-to-peer shipping model that avoids the overhead of warehousing so that every time a garment exchanges hands, a small commission goes through the ownership lineage of that particular item, going all the way back to the brand to incentivize clothing that lasts as long as possible. The US secondhand apparel market is projected to reach $73 billion by 2028, growing 11% annually on average. And Phygital's business model and path to $100 million annual recurring revenue is straightforward. With 250 annual licensed clients, meaning the brands that we work directly with, at an annual licensing fee of $3,000, each client selling 10,000 original garments, and each garment averaging a resale of 4 times at an average garment value of $150, we reached $100 million for Phygitals. If you think this is a good idea, so did Visa. We worked with them on their initial cohort of Web3 creators, where we received introductions and speaking engagement opportunities. So the Phygitals prototype has taken several twists and turns with the fluctuation of Web3 fashion. We built our original prototype on the blockchain back in 2021 with money that we raised through Yale Ventures, and have since pivoted from that perspective to go away from Web3, maintain the same philosophy of the ownership structure and the commissions, but without using blockchain. From there, my career has taken some interesting turns. I graduated from Yale University. I got to meet Stella McCartney, Queen of Sustainable Fashion. And I'm currently working with Bloomsbury Publishing to write their textbook called Sustainability and Social Change in Fashion. I'm also working with the National Science Foundation on an application for their grant in partnership with Oak Ridge Labs. So ultimately, what we're seeing in the textbook are things like diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice in manufacturing, the environmental impact of fast fashion. There's a big emphasis on sustainability systems and legislation, as well as sustainable business logistics and retailing. So if you're interested in helping to reduce the environmental impact of the fast fashion industry, this is a list of 23 potential resolutions related to sustainable and ethical fashion that you can take on. I've taken the liberty of highlighting the ones that I try to adhere to. Number 1, swearing off impulse buying or emotional buying forever. I buy nothing new. If you see me on the street looking fabulous, I'm wearing secondhand clothing 99% of the time. I only buy things that I'll wear at least 30 times. And because of my background in the fashion industry, I do know how to make a piece of fashion whenever the opportunity arises. And with that, that is the conclusion of my presentation. I would love to hear what your thoughts are and hear your questions, whether it's about the career industry, the career progress and the fashion industry, or Phygitals in general.
Feel free to unmute if you have any questions.
For number 13, you said get political. What do you mean by that?
So the legislation around the fashion industry is varying by region. The European Union is pretty well known for having legislation associated with sustainability initiatives across a variety of industries. The United States is not as well known for that, specifically with the fashion industry. However, there are ballots on legislative proposals for different states to be required to have some level of carbon emissions reporting or take back programs to avoid textiles in landfills, that kind of thing. And it makes a big difference throughout the entire supply chain.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
I have a few questions. One, you mentioned about how the products that were used, like when your experiences in factories and everything, it seemed like it just was not sustainable at all. But I think a lot of these work conditions and also the processes are still going on in many areas and many companies.
Mhm.
So, one, like, what is the progress on that? Like, as a society, are we like going towards more sustainable fashion? And what are governments doing or organizations doing to actually promote sustainable fashion?
Mhm. That's a great question. So the word sustainable can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. Sometimes sustainable can refer to ethical labor practices, and sometimes sustainable can adhere to environmental regulations. So from a labor practice perspective, society has gotten a lot better to a degree. Back in the 1990s, there was a huge scandal. There was a talk show host named Kathy Lee Gifford who hosted a morning show. She recently retired again as a morning uh, television host from the Today Show. Uh, Back then, she also had a clothing line at Kmart, and journalists went into her factories and found terrible working conditions, child labor, and things like that. So it made international headlines because she was a well-known celebrity at the time. And funny enough, that launched an initiative called CSR, which is Corporate Social Responsibility. So now, in any type of corporation within the fashion industry, there will be a department, a CSR department, that uses different types of initiatives to go into the factory and oversee the working conditions in that factory. It can include spot visits, um, requiring reporting details. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than it used to be. That only applies to large corporations. So when someone is buying a no-name brand off of Amazon, there's not that level of social oversight that really requires those brands to have corporate social responsibility departments, which obviously is an added cost to that final garment and it makes them less competitive. So, from a corporate responsibility perspective, you can be relatively well assured that you are purchasing something from a labor perspective that at minimum adheres to the country's legal framework. That being said, um, from an economic perspective, as a country rises up through the ranks of development and it gets a middle class, and generally speaking, the fashion industry will oftentimes be the first type of industry that will go into a developing nation and build a factory there because of the low cost of labor. They'll bring in the building, they'll bring in electricity, pipes, plumbing, that kind of thing. And that will generally be kind of the first foray of development in that particular region. And as that economy grows around that factory over time, you have a middle class that is capable of demanding better legislative working conditions from their government. And that's what we've seen in the fashion industry over the last few decades. We've seen um, developing nations become emerged nations, and the policy associated with their labor practices improves, which is great. The problem with that is those better working conditions have costs associated with them. And what the fashion industry will oftentimes do is when the costs become too high in a particular region, they will just pick up and move to a completely different region. And the lowest common denominator of price is usually where they will go. So governments are in an awkward position trying to get the business in order to develop their nations while at the same time remain competitive. So what we have here is a labor standard practice that has generally nothing to do with the actual environmental standard practice. Environmental regulation around the fashion industry is expensive and demanded effectively by no one, which is really unfortunate when we consider the scale at which the fashion industry operates. Consumers aren't interested in sustainable fashion, and they've shown that time and time again with the proliferance of fast fashion brands. And now we see Amazon and the proliferation of Shein and Temu, what we call ultra fast fashion. So governments are reticent to enact legislation around the consumer purchase or the manufacturing process from a sustainability standpoint. Um, and governments within emerging nations are also reticent to do that because it adds costs that makes them less price competitive. The good news is we do see some level of progressive government legislation in places like the EU. We see a little bit of it in the UK, and we see a little bit of it emerging from states like California and proposed ballots in New York City. But at the end of the day, the sustainability component from an environmental perspective really comes down to the consumer and voting with your wallet. Because over the last few years, we've seen economic conditions in the United States be fluctuating. And the interest from consumers in sustainable fashion tends to equally fluctuate with the economic principles that they're being subjected to. So when times are good, consumers speak out about the environmental impact of their fashion consumption. And when times are hard from an economic perspective, it's the first thing to go out the window. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a little follow-up on that with like people don't want to spend money. That's a big thing. And I think with sustainable products, a common like stereotype is that they're going to be expensive. But
Mhm.
how do some companies have like aim to balance that? And with higher quality products, is there like a different um like processing method or something that will reduce costs, or is that, still being in the works
Yeah.
among big manufacturers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Stella McCartney wrote an article a few years ago for the Financial Times called "There's No Such Thing as Sustainable Fashion." She pointed out that we have such an oversupply of clothing at this point on the planet that if all fashion factories shut down tomorrow, we would have 10 years of supply of clothing on the planet. And her perspective was if you are buying something new, it's really unnecessary. So her thought process was if you buy something secondhand, it's already been produced, the carbon emissions have already been associated with it. And effectively, you are saving that item from a very high chance that it will just end up in a landfill. So, from my personal practices, that's how I clothe myself and my children. It helps alleviate the association with that new product manufacturing carbon emissions. Um, to answer your question about business models, we have seen a rise of resale platforms for higher level quality items. We have the Real, Depop. There's a couple of different ways that a consumer can be rewarded for taking advantage of those higher quality items that last beyond, multiple users. But it's clunky. And if you look at the stock price of the Real since its inception, you'll see that it's really hard to nail down a business model because the per unit economics of individual garment resale are very low. And the associated overhead can oftentimes just absolutely sink a stock price.
All right. Any other questions from anyone?
I had one. So, I think like one of the biggest barriers between us and sustainability would be like cost in general. Like as you said, like consumer decisions are affected a lot when economic conditions are good versus bad. I wanted to ask like how do you approach like sustainable fashion, but also like staying cost effective in your business?
So, um, Digitals is trying to create a new business model where everyone is rewarded for making that original higher level price purchase. And the manufacturer oftentimes loses profit margin by creating a slightly better quality piece of clothing. So they're taking a haircut at the very beginning in order to provide some level of differentiation in the market. So once that garment is sold at the original transaction point to their consumer, their involvement with that garment is over, basically, from both economic and a legislative perspective. They're not responsible for it anymore. But what we're trying to incentivize from a consumer economics perspective, from a behavioral economics perspective, is to really understand if I can buy a jacket in the year 2025 and have some level of faith that it will still be in demand, uh, it'll still be a decent quality, people will still like the style, people will see value in that garment in the year 2035, that I will make the original price purchase and swallow that on the front end with the hope that I receive commission at every time it sells in the future. So what we're doing at Digitals right now is playing around with the behavioral economics of that. What level of commission incentivizes me as a consumer to make that original higher price purchase? Or even maybe I'm the third person in that lineage to buy that jacket. At what point is it worth it for me to make that purchase with the belief and the history of other garments that have resold multiple times, hoping that I'll get some of that money back as it exchanges hands? The answer to that is to be determined.
Yeah, so I had another question. So previously, you said that 85% of donations go overseas.
Mhm.
Is there any way to, and they're made out of polyester, right? Is there any way to reuse that material and like turn it into new clothes? And if there
Yeah,
is, has it been implemented yet or no?
it's a really great question. So polyester is just another physical manifestation of oil, and it is extruded in a filament, meaning like a fiber, and then it's woven into factory in the factory into fabric. So there's some really exciting things happening from an innovation standpoint that different companies are trying to reclaim that polyester fabric, melt it, extrude it once again, and reweave it. they've had some level of traction. There are obstacles from a physical perspective. There's only so many times polyester can be melted and rewoven before it chemically breaks down. And the flip side of that obstacle is that it costs more than regular polyester. And so what we've realized is that consumers have gotten so used to buying low quality fast fashion that they're really not willing to make behavioral changes. They're having a tag on a shirt that says this is made out of recycled polyester means generally nothing to the consumer. Even as awareness around fashion sustainability has risen, we haven't really reached a watershed moment, similar to the way that the food and agriculture business reached in the 1990s, early 2000s, where people became really aware of how the farm industry worked and what was the condition of the animals. And they wanted free range eggs and they were interested in organic. There was a watershed moment where that really gained traction. The fashion industry hasn't experienced that yet because fashion brands are really good at sweeping that kind of thing under the rug. Have you guys heard of the term greenwashing? It's where a fashion brand will kind of say they are adhering to the customer demand for sustainability, while at the same time actually increasing their unit production year over year over year to result in higher profits. So we see things like that. And H&M has a take back program that they very much publicize. It is a drop in the bucket in regards to their overall business model and carbon emissions and environmental impact. So the fashion industry are experts at kind of twisting the consumer's head in whatever direction they want to go. If they want to create a trend, they will create a campaign and push that trend and influence consumers to buy it. Fashion brands themselves are not incentivized to push any level of reclaimed fabric, reclaimed textiles, because at the end of the day, consumers aren't interested in it. It costs more to produce, and it really brings attention to their unethical environmental practices to begin with. So there's really not a lot for fashion brands to benefit from, other than business as usual.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I wish that I had like, the silver lining or something like that. And ultimately it's pretty challenging. It's definitely a quagmire of a variety of business influences and consumer demands and manufacturing processes um, that we don't see a lot of traction in, which is why I feel so passionate about talking about it.
So I was wondering basically because many areas where these fast fashion trends are quite prevalent, it's very difficult for lower income communities to access like these more economically sustainable clothing that they need. And it's much easier for them to just quickly, maybe get online or just go to the nearest store and buy these much cheaper clothing resources. So it's not, I wouldn't, so I think it's also about just how easy these are to access rather than just also like the change of viewpoint you were talking about.
Hmm. Yeah,
So yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's definitely a socioeconomic issue. Part of the reason that I am so passionate about the concept of secondhand clothing um, is that we have been subjected to a decades long advertising campaign to convince us as consumers that the only standard of clothing that a self-respecting person would choose is brand new clothing. The reality, the functional reality of that statement is just not true. If you've ever been into a thrift store or a donation store, or even gone through a friend's closet and picked out looking at things. And I understand that this perspective varies significantly between age demographics, between uh, male and female perspectives, between different socioeconomic perspectives. But I want you to think about going to a hotel and sleeping on the sheets in a bed in the hotel. Those sheets have been are technically secondhand. A bunch of different people sleep on those sheets. And for whatever reason, nobody is up in arms about the socioeconomic realities of sleeping on secondhand sheets in a hotel room, right? They're washed, they're cleaned, they function, it's fine. But we have a very different standard of behavior when it comes to clothing. And I just want you to realize that there is an incentive mechanism behind that from a campaign perspective and an advertising perspective, from a very comprehensive global industry that has a lot of money to convince you to feel a different way about clothing and only demand brand new clothing. And it's because that's the only place that they profit. So when we think about different places where we interact with textiles in a public space on a daily basis, there's not an incentive mechanism to make you think that that is weird or uh, a, a lower process for whatever reason. But the advertising industry and the fashion industry have done a very, very comprehensive job of making us think about that with regards to secondhand clothing. And when I was writing my thesis to get into the Yale MBA program, I said we can do all sorts of different, very complicated initiatives to turn the tide on the environmental impact of the fashion industry. We can change the chemical makeup of dye. We can work with multinational overseas governments to improve their standard of environmental impact. We can try all these different innovative standards when it comes to reclaiming textiles and trying to figure out a way. Or we can just change consumers' minds about secondhand fashion. There's an element of achieving the same metric of a goal there, which is reducing the carbon emissions of the fashion industry. And one of them is very complicated, and one of them is influenced by behavioral incentives. And I think that the genesis of digitals really came from that perspective. What is the thing that is going to change consumers' minds most effectively? And that's money. So if I can buy secondhand and sell it, hoping that I'm going to get money on the resale of that garment into the future, that's a behavioral incentive for me. And that's a behavioral incentive for the manufacturer. So I think that there's something really compelling about changing the way that we think about secondhand clothing. I'm certainly a huge fan of vintage items, and there's an element of aesthetic and style that you can create from that that has nothing to do with a brand new shirt or a jacket that came off fresh off of a factory floor. But I understand that that is a controversial statement, and I'm certainly not preaching that it's for everybody.
Any more questions from anyone? All right. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to email Lacie or the Junior Economic Club, and we'll reach out to her. You can also stay back at the end of the meeting if you want to ask anything, directly to Lacie. But other than that, that's all we have planned for today. Lacie, is there any final words from you?
My thinking is that consumers have so much more power than we realize. And the forces that be in our world are generally very good at accumulating power in the hands of a very small group of powerful people. But in mass, people can vote with their wallets and make huge policy changes. And as we enter this new era and a new administration, I think that it's really important that we are constantly voting with our dollars about our values and belief systems, and to keep that in mind as you move forward.
Well said. Well, Lacey, thank you so much for joining today. And for the members, I have one form for you guys to fill out.
Oh, and
Um,
I have the QR code if you need it. You
yep.
need the QR code? Yeah,
It's
I'm ready
just
for you.
so we can understand how you guys felt about the event. And also, if you have any questions for Lacey, you can leave it on there and we'll share it with her afterwards. Um, but once you fill that out, you're good to go. And yeah, thank you so much for attending.
Thanks everybody for having me. I really appreciate it.